In America in 1872 was a country trying to put itself back together. The Civil War was over, but the wounds were still fresh. Reconstruction was happening, but it was messy. People were looking to the future, but they often disagreed on what that future should look like. Cities were growing, industries were taking off. It was a time of great change, great hope, and great division. For women, it was a particularly interesting time. The idea of women having rights, beyond just what their husbands or fathers allowed, was slowly gaining ground. The suffrage movement, the fight for women to vote, was alive, but it was also a long way from its goal. Women couldn't vote in federal elections. They couldn't own property in their own name in many places. Their place was largely seen as being in the home. Society put women in a very small box. Into this world stepped Victoria Woodhull. She was born Victoria Claflin in 1838 in a small town in Ohio. Her family was poor. Her father was a con man, always trying to make a quick buck, often through spiritualism and questionable schemes. Her mother was sick a lot. Victoria and her many siblings had a rough childhood. She got very little formal education. She was married young at 15 to a doctor who turned out to be an alcoholic. They had two children, one of whom had a disability, which was another hardship for her. Victoria herself became involved in spiritualism, which was a popular movement at the time. People believed they could talk to the dead. She and her younger sister, Tennessee Claflin, became known as spiritual mediums. They would hold seances and give readings. This gave them some independence and a way to make money. It also showed them a world beyond their small Ohio town. They traveled around, meeting all sorts of people. But Victoria was restless. She was smart and ambitious. She didn't want to just be a medium. She wanted more, and she wasn't afraid to go after it. So, in the late 1860s, she and Tennessee moved to New York City. This was a big move, a really bold one for two women alone. New York was the center of everything. It was a place where you could reinvent yourself if you were brave enough, and reinvent themselves they did. They somehow met Cornelius Vanderbilt, one of the richest men in America at the time. He was an old man, and he was interested in spiritualism. He was also interested in Tennessee, who was quite charming. Through Vanderbilt, they got into the world of finance. This was unheard of for women. It was a man's world, pure and simple, but Victoria and Tennessee didn't care about what was unheard of. In 1870, they opened Woodhull, Claflin & Co., a brokerage firm on Wall Street. They were the first women to open a brokerage on Wall Street. Imagine that. Women couldn't even vote, but these two were trading stocks. They made a lot of money, quickly. People called them the bewitching brokers or queens of finance. It was scandalous, fascinating, and completely new. They didn't stop there. With their money, they started a newspaper in 1870 called Woodhull and Claflin's Weekly. This wasn't just any newspaper. It was a radical paper. It supported women's suffrage, of course. But it also supported things like free love, short skirts for women, prostitution rights, and even communism. It was a platform for Victoria's increasingly bold and unconventional ideas. Her newspaper became famous for publishing the first English translation of Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto. It also became famous for exposing scandals. Victoria was not afraid to speak her mind, and she was not afraid to challenge the powerful. She was a force of nature. She looked proper, often dressed in fashionable clothes, but her ideas were anything but proper for the time. She was articulate, intelligent, and fearless. She was also controversial, even among other women's rights advocates. She pushed boundaries way beyond what most people were ready for, but that was Victoria Woodhull. She never waited for others to catch up. She just went ahead. The year 1872 was a big year for America. It was a presidential election year. Ulysses S. Grant, the Civil War general, was running for re-election as a Republican. Horace Greeley, a famous newspaper editor, was running against him as a liberal Republican and Democrat. The country was still figuring out its identity after the war. People were talking about Reconstruction, about corruption, about the economy. But in the middle of all this, Victoria Woodhull did something truly astonishing. She announced she was running for President of the United States. She declared her candidacy in 1870, but 1872 was the election year. This was not a joke. She was serious. She was nominated by a new small political party called the Equal Rights Party. This party was formed specifically to support her and her ideas. Her platform was incredibly progressive for the time, even for today, in some ways. And she advocated for women's suffrage, of course. That was a given for her. But she also supported labor reforms, like the 8-hour workday. She spoke about social justice for all, including the poor and marginalized. She talked about universal education. And she talked about something called free love. This was perhaps her most controversial idea, and it would cause her a lot of trouble. We'll get to that. Now, who did she pick as her running mate? This was another truly remarkable choice. She chose Frederick Douglass. Douglass was one of the most famous and respected abolitionists and advocates for civil rights in American history. He was a former slave who had become a powerful orator and writer. He was a towering figure. The Equal Rights Party nominated him without his knowledge or consent. Douglass never acknowledged the nomination. He actually supported Grant in that election, but the fact that Woodhull picked an African-American man as her running mate, especially one of Douglass's stature, shows just how radical and forward-thinking she was. This was in an era when racial equality was still a distant dream for many, and when black men had only very recently gained the right to vote in theory, not always in practice. Her decision to run for president caused an absolute uproar. Many people found it completely absurd. A woman for president? It was unthinkable. Women couldn't even vote. How could one run for the highest office in the land? Many laughed at her. Many were disgusted. Some simply didn't know how to react. Even within the women's suffrage movement, her candidacy was met with mixed feelings, often outright hostility. Some prominent suffragists, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, respected her intelligence and her courage. They admired her willingness to challenge norms, but they were also wary of her radical ideas, especially free love. They worried her association with the movement would hurt their cause. They were trying to make women's suffrage seem respectable and mainstream. Victoria Woodhull was anything but respectable and mainstream. She was a tornado. There was also a legal question that people raised. The U.S. Constitution states that a president must be at least 35 years old. In 1872, Victoria Woodhull was 34. She would not turn 35 until September 1873, well after the election and the inauguration. This was a clear constitutional barrier, so even if she had somehow won, she would not have been legally eligible to take office. Many people pointed this out, but Woodhull didn't let that stop her. She argued that the spirit of her candidacy was what mattered. She was making a statement. She was showing that a woman could aspire to the presidency regardless of the immediate legalities. Her run was shocking because it directly challenged every single assumption about women in power. Women were supposed to be gentle, domestic, and quiet. Victoria Woodhull was none of those things. She was loud, she was public, she was fierce. She stood on platforms and spoke to large crowds of men and women. She wrote editorials, she ran a business, and now she wanted to lead the country. It was an act of audacious courage, a direct slap in the face of the patriarchal society of the time. Her candidacy, even if doomed from the start, was a lightning bolt across the American political landscape, showing a future that few were ready to imagine. Victoria Woodhull's campaign for president was less a traditional political campaign and more a series of fiery speeches and bold pronouncements. Her platform was revolutionary, but it was her personal life and her outspoken views on free love that truly defined the public's perception of her. And those perceptions were often very, very negative. What exactly did Victoria Woodhull mean by free love? It's not what many people thought it meant then, and it's not exactly what some people might think it means now. For Woodhull, free love was about a woman's right to choose her partners, to have autonomy over her own body and her own relationships. She believed that marriage should be a matter of personal choice and affection, not a legal or economic bind. If a marriage became loveless or oppressive, she argued, a woman should be free to leave it without social stigma. She felt that traditional marriage laws and societal expectations trapped women. She was against forced unions and for emotional honesty in relationships. She believed in the freedom to love who you wanted, when you wanted, as long as it didn't hurt anyone else. However, in the deeply conservative Victorian era, her words were often misinterpreted. Many saw free love as an endorsement of promiscuity, of abandoning marriage, and of moral chaos. To many, it was an attack on the very foundations of society. This view of her as a free lover fueled much of the public's outrage and disgust. It made it easy for her opponents to dismiss her as immoral, unstable, and unworthy of serious consideration. Woodhull used her newspaper, Woodhull and Claflin's Weekly, as her primary platform. She wrote lengthy editorials, published her speeches, and advocated for her radical ideas. She gave lectures in public halls, sometimes to thousands of people. She was a powerful speaker, very charismatic. But her words, especially about marriage and sex, created a storm. The backlash was immense. She faced constant criticism, ridicule, and moral condemnation. Ministers preached against her from their pulpits. Other newspapers attacked her fiercely, calling her a harlot, a social monster, and worse. Even many women, including some involved in the suffrage movement, distanced themselves from her. They feared her radicalism would taint their own more moderate efforts. They wanted to show that women could be respectable and deserving of the vote. Victoria Woodhull, with her talk of free love and her scandalous personal history, she had divorced and remarried, and her first husband still lived with her family for a time, did not fit their idea of respectability. One of the most damaging episodes involved the famous preacher Henry Ward Beecher, brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. Beecher was a celebrated figure, a moral leader, known for his eloquent sermons and progressive views on abolition. But there were rumors about his private life, specifically that he was having an affair with a parishioner, Elizabeth Tilton, who was married to his friend and colleague, Theodore Tilton. Victoria Woodhull, in her typical fearless fashion, decided to expose this hypocrisy. She had been privately told about the affair and believed that Beecher, who preached morality to the masses while allegedly violating his own standards, was a hypocrite. In November 1872, just days before the presidential election, Woodhull published a detailed account of the Beecher-Tilton scandal in her newspaper. And she laid out the allegations, presenting it as an example of the kind of sexual hypocrisy that her free love principles were meant to combat. She argued that men like Beecher, who publicly condemned her for her views on sexuality, were secretly doing much worse. The impact was explosive. The article immediately caused a national sensation. It was a massive scandal, perhaps the biggest of its kind in 19th century America. It shattered Beecher's pristine image and caused a huge public outcry, but for Victoria Woodhull, the consequences were severe and immediate. The authorities under the Comstock Act and obscenity law arrested Woodhull and her sister Tennessee Claflin on Election Day itself, November 5th, 1872. They were charged with publishing obscene material and for mailing it through the U.S. Postal Service. The Beecher-Tilton article was considered obscene because it discussed adultery, which was a taboo subject in public discourse. This arrest effectively silenced her just as the election was happening. She spent time in jail, first in New York and then at Ludlow Street Jail, a notorious debtor's prison. The arrest and the scandal completely overshadowed her presidential campaign. The public focused on the alleged obscenity and the moral implications, not on her political platform. Her name became synonymous with scandal and impropriety. Her bold challenge to the political system was sidelined by a very public fight over morality and sexuality. It was a brutal end to an already tumultuous campaign, a clear signal that society was not ready for a woman like Victoria Woodhull, who dared to speak so openly about sex, power, and freedom. After the whirlwind of the 1872 election and her arrest, Victoria Woodhull's life didn't suddenly become quiet. Far from it. She and her sister Tennessee faced legal battles for months. The charges under the Comstock Act were serious. They were accused of sending obscene material through the mail, which carried potential jail time and fines. These trials dragged on, keeping them in the public eye, but in a very negative light. They were eventually acquitted of the charges, but the legal fight took a toll, financially and emotionally. The Beecher-Tilton scandal, which she exposed, also continued to dominate headlines. It led to a very public and drawn-out civil trial between Theodore Tilton and Henry Ward Beecher, which captivated the nation for months. Woodhull's name was often brought up during these proceedings, cementing her image as a scandalous figure. The controversy and the arrests had a devastating effect on Woodhull, Claflin & Co., their brokerage firm. Their clients pulled out, their reputation was ruined. The weekly newspaper, Woodhull and Claflin's Weekly, also struggled and eventually ceased publication in 1876. Her financial resources dwindled, her public support, which was always limited, evaporated even more. Many of the suffragists who had once cautiously supported her, or at least tolerated her, now completely disowned her. They felt she had done irreparable damage to the cause of women's rights by associating it with free love and scandal. By the late 1870s, Victoria Woodhull decided to leave America. The relentless attacks and the exhaustion from years of fighting had worn her down. In 1877, she and Tennessee moved to England. This was a significant turning point in her life. She essentially left behind her radical American persona and sought a new beginning. In England, Victoria continued to lecture, though her topics became somewhat less incendiary. She focused more on spiritualism, women's rights, and social reform, but with a more moderated tone. She met and eventually married John Biddulph Martin, a wealthy British banker, in 1883. This marriage brought her financial stability and social respectability she had never truly known in America. She lived a comfortable life, often entertaining intellectuals and socialites at her country estate. She even began to rehabilitate her public image, portraying herself as a respectable advocate for social causes rather than a scandalous firebrand. Her later life was much calmer. She continued to write and publish, often with her daughter Zula Maud Woodhull. She became involved in various philanthropic activities. She lived a long life, passing away in 1927 at the age of 89. What was the immediate impact of her presidential run? In the short term, it probably hurt the suffrage movement more than it helped. Her association with free love and the scandals made it easier for opponents of women's suffrage to dismiss all women's rights advocates as immoral and radical. For many years, her name was a byword for dangerous ideas. However, in the long term, her significance became clearer. Victoria Woodhull was a pioneer. She shattered expectations. She showed that a woman, however controversial, could dare to aspire to the highest office in the land. She forced people to confront uncomfortable questions about gender, power, and freedom. Even though she didn't win and couldn't have legally taken office due to her age, her act of running was a powerful statement. She put the idea of a woman president into the public consciousness, even if it was met with outrage. She pushed the boundaries of what was considered acceptable for women to say, do, and be. She spoke about issues like sex education, labor rights, and social justice long before they were mainstream. Her courage, her intelligence, and her refusal to be silenced, even when facing massive public condemnation, made her a figure of enduring historical importance. She was ahead of her time, perhaps too far ahead for many of her contemporaries, but her story laid some groundwork for the future, a future where women would indeed run for and hold powerful offices. She was a flash of lightning, showing what was possible, even if the rest of society was still stuck in the dark. The core question we started with was, did a woman run for president 50 years before women could vote? The answer, as we've seen, is yes, essentially. Victoria Woodhull ran for president in 1872. Women in the United States gained the right to vote nationally with the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. That's a difference of 48 years. So saying about 50 years is quite accurate. This timing is crucial. It highlights just how far ahead of her time Victoria Woodhull truly was. In 1872, the idea of women voting, let alone running for president, was radical, almost laughable to most of society. Women were not considered full citizens in the same way men were. They were largely excluded from politics, business, and most public life. Their voices were supposed to be heard only within the confines of their homes, if at all. So, how could she run if women couldn't vote? This is a key distinction. The U.S. Constitution sets out the qualifications for being president: a natural-born citizen, at least 35 years old, and a resident of the U.S. for 14 years. It does not mention gender. The Constitution was, in this regard, silent on whether a woman could hold the office. Therefore, technically, there was no explicit legal barrier preventing a woman from running or even being elected president based on her gender. The barrier was societal, cultural, and political. And in Woodhull's specific case, the age requirement was a very real legal hurdle she couldn't overcome. She was 34 in 1872, not 35. This meant even if she had won, she couldn't have taken office. But this was a separate issue from her gender. Her candidacy, then, was less about her actual chances of winning and more about making a profound statement. It was a challenge to the entire system. She wasn't running just to get votes, she was running to prove a point. She was showing the absurdity of a system that denied women the vote but didn't explicitly bar them from the presidency. It was a way of saying, if I can run, why can't other women vote? Victoria Woodhull's run was deeply symbolic. It was a direct confrontational act against the norms of her time. She put herself out there knowing full well the ridicule and condemnation she would face. She was, in essence, demanding that society recognize women's potential beyond the domestic sphere. She wasn't just asking for the vote, she was demanding full equality, including the right to lead. Her courage in doing this cannot be overstated. Imagine standing up in a public forum in 1872 as a woman and declaring yourself a presidential candidate. The sheer audacity of it. She faced immediate and widespread scorn. She was called terrible names, accused of being immoral, and eventually arrested. This was the price she paid for being so far ahead of her time. While her immediate impact on the suffrage movement might have been perceived as negative due to the controversy she stirred, her long-term role as a pioneer is undeniable. As she planted a seed, she showed a future that many couldn't yet see. She demonstrated that women had the intellect, the ambition, and the capability to engage in the highest levels of politics. She broke the mold entirely. In a way, she forced people to think about women in power, even if they were thinking about it with disgust or ridicule. That thought, however negative, was a necessary step. It made the idea, however distant, slightly less impossible. When women finally did get the vote, and decades later when women started running for president in more serious and widespread ways, Victoria Woodhull's name was often brought up, a reminder of the first woman who dared to try. So, yes, a woman did run for president about 50 years before most women in America could vote. Well, Victoria Woodhull was a complex, controversial, and incredibly brave figure. Her life was a testament to pushing boundaries, challenging hypocrisy, and demanding equality long before society was ready to accept it. She may not have won the presidency, but she won a place in history as an audacious trailblazer who dared to dream of a different world for women long before most others could even conceive of it.